All right, wow, for once, hi, thanks to everyone for watching and thank you to my subscribers, by the way. So, for once, I actually agree with the mainstream media. This is exactly what I think is going to happen. Business economists worry about possible recession in 2020. And it's funny, as I just thought of this last week, it just popped in my head. That's what I really think is going to happen. The 2020s are going to be known as the Greater Depression. And it's even been called that. And just even outside of that, because I think even in that movie Jack Ryan, where they talk about the countries that are around the world, I think they even mention specifically Saudi Arabia, but don't quote me. It's Saudi Arabia or maybe Russia, but it's one of those, I'm almost positive, where they talk about all the countries basically on the other side of the world there, dumping the United States dollar and causing the American economy to collapse, which then brings on what they call the Greater Depression in the United States. And so you had the Great Depression in the 20s, or excuse me. You had the Great Depression in the 30s last time. Now I think we're going to have it in the 20s because you had the Great Stock Market Crash of 1929, and then you had the Great Depression of the 30s. Well, I think we're going to have the Great Stock Market Crash of 2019, and then the Greater Depression in the 20s. And we even have history as a guide to say that this very, very, very well could happen. Because in 2007, you had that crack in the market, that moment where it was shown that, hey, things aren't so good. Even despite it looks that way, and despite what the propaganda says, and despite what the banks say, the stock market, this economy is not as great as they're saying it is. It's not as held together as they say it is. And then what happened? In 2008, a year and some change later, you had the biggest stock market crash of all time. And so whenever 2018, whenever we had that huge, the biggest one of all time now, earlier in 2018, you had a lot of people who were around then and were in the market then and said, man, I tell you what, this is real reminiscent of 2007. This could be that moment where, hey, they're trying to tell you things really aren't that great after all, and maybe this is a bunch of bullshit. So it took a year and some change to crash for good for the biggest one ever at the time. It took a year and some change after that moment in 2007, so this could be that moment again. And wouldn't that be funny, man? Wouldn't that be funny? In 2019, because if that's the case, if history says a year and some change, so that would put it sometime in 2019. Wouldn't that be funny? You had the great stock market crash of 1929 and then the Great Depression in the 30s. Then we'll have the great stock market crash of 2019 and then the Greater Depression in the 20s. And with a headline like this, it almost sounds like they're thinking and telling you that could possibly be exactly what happens. And here's the Roaring 20s, right? 1920. The Roaring 20s was the period of Western society and Western culture that occurred during and around the 1920s. It was a period of sustained economic prosperity with a distinctive cultural edge in the United States and Western Europe. And if you turn on the TV, if you look at, except for this article, you look anywhere else, they'll tell you everything's going great. And that's exactly what we've had. We haven't had the Roaring 20s. We've had the Roaring, 2000s. Or 2010's, really, which is funny. The Roaring 20s, well, it's really been the Roaring 2010's, because basically you want to say from 2008, 9-ish, up until this point, we've had all this QE and all this, stimulus. And that's what they tell you. Everything is going great. We're in a recovery. We're in a recovery. When they know damn well that it's just as shitty as it was all those years ago, just like in the 20s. So this is seriously playing out. I mean, we are living, wow. Talk about echo. Talk about exact same thing. Talk about doppelganger, man. So I think it's going to happen. So great stock market crash in 1929, followed by the Great Depression in the 30s. Great stock market crash of 2019, followed by the Greater Depression of the 20s. History says that could very well happen, because that's what happened in 2007 and 2008. And 2018, people saying sounded a hell of a lot like 2007. And not to mention, we have our star alignments and all this stuff saying that when these planets do this certain kind of dance that they're doing right now, this kind of shit happens on top of it. You got countless predictive propaganda and predictive programming. And we don't learn from history, right? Even though we have, and this is echoing history just like I've said, right? Like a mofo. We don't learn history, and they say those who don't learn history are doomed to repeat it. And that's what we do. That's what it's all about, is not going forward, not making those steps forward because you're too busy reliving the past. So that's what we're going to do. So instead of the 30s, this time it's going to be the 20s because we're taking a step backwards. Yep, that's about it. So please check out my music.